It was one of those mornings when everything seemed to go wrong. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking through jackets and shoes, and traffic crawled as if the city itself had decided to slow down. In courtroom 4C, Judge William Harrington took his seat with the air of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. Known for his strict adherence to the law and no-nonsense demeanor, he was a figure both feared and respected in the legal community. His stern expression rarely softened, and today was no different. The first case on the docket was an ordinary civil dispute. At least it seemed so on paper. A minor infraction had brought a young woman, Tasha Williams, before the court. As she stepped up to the bench, her confidence was palpable, yet there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She was well dressed, poised, and carried herself with a quiet dignity. Tasha was no stranger to the courtroom. But this wasn't her typical role. She was usually the one standing behind the table, representing clients, not the one being summoned to defend herself. Judge Harrington barely glanced at her as he reviewed the documents in front of him. "Miss Williams," he began, his tone brisk, "you've been charged with failing to comply with the parking ordinance. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," she replied firmly, her voice calm but resolute. Harrington looked up for the first time, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. There was something about her, something familiar, though he couldn't place it. It was a fleeting thought, quickly buried beneath years of practice in impartiality. He proceeded with the case, questioning her about the details and reviewing the evidence presented. Tasha held her ground, explaining her side of the story with precision. Her argument was compelling, and it was clear she wasn't just another defendant fumbling through legal jargon. Harrington found himself mildly impressed, though he would never admit it. She was articulate, confident, and unwavering in her stance. The session proceeded like any other until a brief pause allowed Harrington to glance at her again. This time, something caught his attention. A familiarity in her features. It wasn't just her confidence or eloquence. It was something deeper, something unsettling. His brow furrowed slightly, but he quickly dismissed the thought. Judges didn't have the luxury of indulging personal curiosities. As the proceedings wrapped up, Harrington delivered a modest fine, much lower than what he typically handed down for similar cases. Tasha accepted the ruling with grace, thanked the court, and exited the room. For most, that would have been the end of a forgettable encounter, but for Harrington it lingered. There was an unease he couldn't shake, an unanswered question that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Later that day, as he sifted through case files in his chambers, his mind wandered back to Tasha Williams. He couldn't explain it, but something about her presence had unsettled him in a way he hadn't felt in years. He shook his head, scolding himself for allowing distractions to cloud his judgment. The following week, Harrington attended a private gathering hosted by a prominent colleague. Among the attendees was his daughter, Melissa, a sharp and ambitious attorney who had recently made waves in the legal world. As they caught up over a glass of wine, Melissa mentioned a big case she was preparing for. "It's a tough one, Dad," she said, her tone both proud and nervous. "But I've got an incredible co-counsel. You'd love her. Smart, driven, doesn't back down from a challenge." Harrington smiled faintly. "Sounds like a solid choice. What's her name?" "Tasha Williams," Melissa said casually, not noticing the sudden stillness in her father's expression. For a moment, Harrington felt the air leave the room. The name echoed in his mind, triggering a flood of emotions he couldn't quite place. "Tasha Williams," he repeated, his voice strained. Melissa nodded. "Yeah, you know her?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. Memories of a life he thought he had left behind, of mistakes he had never fully atoned for. As he pieced together the fragments of a story he had tried to forget, the realization hit him like a thunderbolt. Tasha Williams wasn't just a name in a case file or a skilled attorney standing beside his daughter. She was someone he should have known long before this moment. But how could he tell Melissa? How could he confront a truth that threatened to unravel not just his life, but hers as well? The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, but Harrington felt utterly alone. The weight of his discovery pressed heavily on his chest, and for the first time in years, the man who prided himself on control felt completely powerless. As the evening wore on, Judge Harrington couldn't shake the storm brewing inside him. Melissa had moved on to another group of colleagues, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the turmoil her casual mention had unleashed. Tasha Williams. The name replayed in his mind like a song he couldn't forget, each repetition driving him deeper into memories he had long buried. It had been more than 3 decades since those days, his youth, when life felt less rigid and rules seemed more like suggestions. Back then, he was a man of ambition, but also recklessness. He'd made choices he wasn't proud of, choices that had consequences he had tried desperately to ignore. A fleeting relationship, a night of passion that seemed inconsequential at the time, but one that had haunted the edges of his conscience for years. Her name was Angela Williams. She was brilliant, driven, and unapologetically bold, traits that both intrigued and intimidated him. They met during a legal seminar, 2 young minds eager to leave their mark on the world. Their connection had been instant, a spark that quickly ignited into a flame. But it burned out just as quickly, extinguished by his fear of commitment and the demands of his burgeoning career. Angela had tried to reach him once after they parted ways. She'd called, left a message that he never returned. Her voice on the recording was steady, but there was a weight to her words that he chose not to unpack. "William, I need to talk to you. It's important." He never called back. And now, decades later, here he was, staring at the possibility that Angela's important news might have been something he should have listened to. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He needed answers, but where would he even begin? Confronting Melissa wasn't an option, not yet. She adored Tasha, spoke of her as a trusted partner, someone she admired deeply. Dropping a bombshell like this would only complicate things further, and he wasn't even sure of the truth. But he had to know. The next day, Harrington made a call. He reached out to a former colleague, someone with access to records and a knack for discretion. "I need some information," he said, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. "About a woman named Tasha Williams. She's an attorney. Anything you can find. Education, family background, that sort of thing." His contact didn't press for details, agreeing to look into it. Harrington ended the call, feeling both anxious and guilty. This wasn't how he usually operated. He prided himself on integrity, on separating personal emotions from professional obligations. But this wasn't just about him. If his suspicions were correct, it would change everything. For him, for Melissa, and most of all for Tasha. As he waited for answers, he found himself replaying every moment of his interaction with Tasha in the courtroom. Her confidence, her eloquence, even the subtle ways she carried herself, all of it seemed to connect to a past he had tried to forget. Meanwhile, Tasha had no idea about the storm brewing in Harrington's life. She was busy preparing for the trial she and Melissa were set to tackle together. The 2 women had become fast friends during their time at the firm, their mutual respect growing with each case they worked on. Melissa admired Tasha's ability to think on her feet, her dedication to her clients, and her unwavering sense of justice. But for Tasha, it wasn't just about the law. Her work was personal. She had grown up watching her mother struggle, fighting against a system that often seemed stacked against her. Angela Williams had been a single mother, raising Tasha while pursuing her own career as a community advocate. She was Tasha's hero, her guiding star. Angela had taught her to stand tall, to speak out, and to never back down from a fight worth fighting. Tasha had never known her father. Angela rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was with a mix of regret and resolve. "He made his choice," Angela would say, her tone firm, but not bitter. "And I made mine. We're better off without him." As Tasha grew older, she stopped asking questions. Her mother had given her everything she needed: love, support, and a sense of purpose. But that didn't mean the curiosity ever fully went away. There were moments, especially when she faced challenges, where she wondered who he was, what kind of man could walk away so easily. The call from Harrington's contact came sooner than expected. Information was brief but telling. Tasha Williams, 32 years old. Graduated top of her class from Howard University School of Law. Mother's name, Angela Williams. No father listed. Harrington's chest tightened. It was all falling into place. The timelines, the connections, the nagging familiarity he had felt in her presence. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the revelation pressed down on him. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't keep this to himself forever, but how could he possibly explain it to Tasha or to Melissa? How could he bridge the gap between the man he had been and the man he was now? In the days that followed, Harrington found himself watching Melissa and Tasha from a distance as they worked on their case. They were a formidable team, their camaraderie evident in the way they exchanged ideas and tackled challenges. It was clear that Tasha had become more than just a colleague to Melissa. She was a trusted friend. But for Harrington, every interaction between them was a painful reminder of the truth he was hiding. He wanted to speak to Tasha, to explain, to apologize. Every time he thought about it, the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say that would make up for years of absence, of silence? And then there was the trial itself, a high-profile case that would bring them all together in the courtroom once again. Harrington wasn't presiding this time, but he planned to attend as an observer, a silent presence in the back of the room. He told himself it was to support Melissa, but deep down, he knew the real reason. He needed to see Tasha in action, to understand the person she had become, to witness the strength and determination that had brought her this far. As the trial date approached, the tension in Harrington's life reached a breaking point. He knew he couldn't avoid the truth forever. Sooner or later, the secrets he had buried would come to light, and when they did, there would be no going back. For now, all he could do was wait and watch, the weight of his past looming over him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The trial had begun. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet energy of anticipation, the kind that made even the most seasoned attorneys double-check their notes. Tasha Williams and Melissa Harrington sat side by side at the plaintiff's table, an impressive Jew radiating focus and confidence. Their client, a young single mother wronged by a corporate giant, looked to them with a mixture of hope and desperation. This case wasn't just about money, it was about justice, and both attorneys knew the stakes couldn't be higher. Judge William Harrington entered the courtroom quietly, taking a seat among the observers at the back. He wasn't there as a father or a man seeking closure. Not yet. He was there as a spectator, watching the unfolding drama with a vested interest he couldn't admit to anyone. His heart was heavy as he watched Tasha organize her files, her calm efficiency a testament to her skill and dedication. It was a strange mixture of pride and regret that he felt, one that gnawed at him as the proceedings began. Tasha opened with a powerful argument, her voice steady and clear as she outlined her client's case. She was compelling, weaving facts and emotions seamlessly, painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. Melissa followed, adding her own perspective with the same sharp intelligence Harrington had always admired in her. Together, they made a formidable team, and for a moment he felt an odd sense of relief. At least he thought they had each other. But the defense was no less prepared. Representing the corporate giant was a seasoned attorney named Victor Greer, a man known for his ruthless tactics and sharp intellect. He wasted no time attempting to dismantle the foundation Tasha and Melissa had built. His cross-examinations were pointed, his arguments persuasive. Tasha, however, stood her ground. She countered his every move with calm precision, refusing to let him dominate the narrative. From his seat in the back, Harrington watched with bated breath. He found himself analyzing every word, every gesture, not just as a judge, but as a father, if he could even call himself that. Tasha didn't falter, even under the relentless pressure Greer applied. She was fierce, determined, and unshakable, and Harrington couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration mixed with guilt. As the trial progressed, Melissa began to notice something strange about her father's presence. He rarely attended trials he wasn't directly involved in, especially those of attorneys he knew well. His quiet but consistent appearance at this particular case didn't sit right with her. At first, she chalked it up to his interest in her career. But there was something in his demeanor, a tension, a watchfulness that made her uneasy. One evening after court, Melissa decided to confront him. She found him in his chambers, going over paperwork, but his distraction was evident. "Dad," she began cautiously, "why are you really here?" Harrington glanced up, startled, then quickly masked his discomfort. "You're my daughter. Do I need a reason to support you?" Melissa crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You've never come to watch my trials before. Not like this. And it's not just me you're watching, is it?" Her words hung in the air, the weight of them heavy between them. Harrington sighed, setting down his pen. "Melissa, there's something I need to tell you, but it's complicated." Melissa's brow furrowed, her curiosity piqued, and her concern deepening. "What is it? Just say it, Dad." Harrington hesitated, the words on the tip of his tongue but impossible to release. How could he tell her the truth without turning her world upside down? He shook his head, choosing his words carefully. "I'll tell you when the time is right. For now, focus on the trial. You and Tasha are doing incredible work." Melissa frowned but didn't press further. She knew her father well enough to recognize when he had reached his limit. Still, his evasiveness only added to the growing sense of unease she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Tasha found herself grappling with her own set of questions. She had noticed the older man sitting at the back of the courtroom, his presence both unassuming and oddly significant. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. His gaze lingered on her longer than most observers, and while it wasn't overtly intrusive, it was enough to make her wonder. During a brief recess, she mentioned it to Melissa. "Who's the man in the back?" "The one who's been watching every day." Melissa glanced over her shoulder, spotting her father immediately. "That's my dad," she said with a smile. "Judge Harrington. He likes to keep an eye on me sometimes." Tasha nodded, but the name struck a chord she didn't expect. Harrington. It was a name she had come across before, though she couldn't remember where. Her mother had rarely spoken about the past, but every now and then, in moments of vulnerability, she had mentioned a man who had left her behind. A man named William. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. That evening, Tasha decided to dig deeper. She went home and opened the small box of keepsakes her mother had left her before passing away. A box she rarely touched. Inside were photographs, letters, and a single cassette tape labeled simply, "For Tasha." Her hands trembled as she played the tape, the sound of her mother's voice filling the room. "Tasha, my beautiful girl," Angela began, her tone steady but tinged with emotion. "There are things I never told you, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. Your father, his name was William Harrington. He was a young lawyer when we met, full of ambition and charm. We had something special, but it didn't last. He walked away when I told him I was pregnant. I don't know if he'll ever come back, but I want you to know it wasn't your fault. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." Tasha sat frozen, the weight of her mother's words crushing down on her. William Harrington. Judge Harrington. The man who had fined her just weeks ago, the man sitting quietly in the back of her courtroom now. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of her life with this new revelation. The next morning, as Tasha faced Judge Harrington in the courtroom once again, her composure was intact, but her heart was anything but. Every glance in his direction carried a question she wasn't ready to ask. And Harrington, for his part, could feel a shift in her demeanor, though he couldn't yet place its cause. The trial continued, the tension mounting with each passing day. But beneath the surface, a far more personal battle was brewing, one that neither Tasha nor Harrington could avoid much longer. The courtroom was electric with tension as the trial neared its critical phase. Tasha and Melissa had spent long nights poring over evidence, fine-tuning their arguments, and preparing for the final stretch. The weight of their client's future, of what this case meant to her life and livelihood, pressed down on them. But for Tasha, the pressure was doubled. She carried a secret she hadn't shared with anyone, not even Melissa. Every time she glanced toward the back of the courtroom, her chest tightened. Judge Harrington's presence felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. She replayed her mother's words from the tape in her head, each repetition cutting deeper. How was she supposed to focus on this case when the man she now believed was her father sat silently, watching her every move? And what did he know? Had he figured it out too? Harrington, for his part, was unraveling. Sitting through each day of the trial felt like torture. He had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but now he was anything but. Every word Tasha spoke, every confident gesture, reminded him of Angela. The resemblance was undeniable, not just in her features, but in her fire, her determination. He wanted to approach her, to say something. Anything, but the timing never felt right. Melissa had also noticed the shift in Tasha. Normally composed and steady, Tasha seemed distracted, her focus wavering at odd moments. She caught Tasha staring at her father more than once, her expression unreadable but intense. Melissa brushed it off at first, thinking it was just nerves from the high-profile case. But as the days passed, the tension between Tasha and her father became impossible to ignore. During a break in the proceedings, Melissa confronted Tasha. "Okay, Spill. What's going on?" Tasha blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting weird all week," Melissa said, crossing her arms. "And you keep looking at my dad like he's a puzzle you're trying to solve. Is there something I should know?" Tasha hesitated, her heart pounding. This was her chance to say it, to lay everything out in the open. But the words felt heavy, tangled in her throat. How could she tell Melissa that the man she admired most might be the father who had abandoned her? "It's nothing," Tasha said finally, forcing a smile. "Just stress. This case is getting to me, that's all." Melissa didn't look convinced, but she let it go. "Okay, but if something's bothering you, you can tell me. We're a team, remember?" Tasha nodded, guilt twisting in her stomach. Melissa deserved the truth, but the thought of what that truth might do to their friendship held her back. The trial resumed, and the tension in the room was palpable. Victor Greer, the defense attorney, launched into a scathing cross-examination of Tasha's client, aiming to discredit her story and shift the jury's sympathy. Tasha stood to object, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. As she argued, her eyes flicked toward Harrington again, searching for what? Approval? Understanding? She didn't know. All she knew was that his presence loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Harrington caught the look, his heart sinking. He wanted to stand up, to say something, to stop this charade before it went any further. But he stayed rooted in place, his silence growing heavier with each passing moment. By the end of the day, everyone was exhausted. Melissa and Tasha sat in their office, reviewing notes for the closing arguments they would deliver the next morning. Melissa tried to lighten the mood, cracking a joke about Greer's over-the-top theatrics. But Tasha barely reacted. "You're seriously worrying me now," Melissa said, setting her pen down. "Whatever's going on, it's more than just a trial. I can see it." Tasha looked at her chest tightening with a mix of fear and frustration. Melissa had always been kind to her, always treated her like a friend, a partner. How would she react to the truth? Would she feel betrayed, angry, confused? But before Tasha could say anything, there was a knock at the door. Both women turned to see Harrington standing there, his expression unreadable. "Dad," Melissa said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Harrington stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His gaze moved to Tasha, lingering there for a moment before he spoke. "I need to talk to both of you," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Tasha felt her pulse quicken. Was this it? Was he about to say what she thought he was? She glanced at Melissa, whose confusion was evident. "Dad, what's going on?" Melissa asked, her tone cautious. Harrington took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Tasha. "There's something I need to tell you," he began. "Something I should have said a long time ago." The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with tension. Tasha gripped the edge of the table, bracing herself for whatever came next. And Melissa, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell silent, her gaze darting between her father and her best friend. Harrington hesitated, the weight of his words catching in his throat. He had spent years running from the truth, but now, faced with the two people who mattered most, He could no longer avoid it. "I think," he started, then stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I think I might be your father, Tasha." The room went still, the silence stiffening. Tasha's heart pounded in her chest, the words hitting her like a tidal wave. Melissa's jaw dropped, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a moment, no one spoke, the enormity of Harrington's confession hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The silence in the room was suffocating. Tasha sat frozen, the words, "I think I might be your father," echoing in her mind. She looked at Judge Harrington, searching his face for some sign of insincerity, but all she saw was raw vulnerability. It was as if the weight of decades had finally caught up to him, and this confession had broken something inside him. Melissa was the first to react, her voice sharp and disbelieving. "What are you talking about, Dad? How could you be her father?" She turned to Tasha, her eyes wide with shock. "Did you know about this?" Tasha shook her head, her throat tight. "I didn't know until recently. My mom left me a recording. She said his name was William Harrington. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't know how to tell you." Melissa staggered back, as if the words had physically hit her. "This doesn't make sense. How could you not say anything? How could you let me sit here, work with you, trust you, while you kept this from me?" "I wasn't sure," Tasha said, her voice trembling. "And I didn't want to ruin what we have. You're my friend, Melissa. I didn't know how to tell you without losing that." Melissa looked at her father, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "And you," she said, her voice rising, "what does this even mean? You had a child with someone and just, what? Walked away, pretended it never happened." Harrington's face crumpled, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of her accusations. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear to you, Melissa, I didn't know Tasha existed. Angela and I, we were young, and when things ended, I had no idea she was pregnant. If I had known, I would have." "Would have what?" Melissa interrupted, her tone biting. "Been there, been a father, because from where I'm standing, you barely managed to do that for me." Tasha watched the exchange, her emotions a whirlwind of hurt, anger, and confusion. This wasn't how she had imagined things unfolding. She had thought she would confront Harrington privately, that there might be some quiet moment of reconciliation. Instead, it had turned into a storm she couldn't control. Before Harrington could respond, there was another knock at the door. It swung open to reveal Victor Greer, the opposing counsel. His timing couldn't have been worse. He stepped inside, oblivious to the tension in the room, holding a folder with an air of smugness. "Sorry to interrupt," Greer said, his tone anything but apologetic. "But I thought you might want to see this." He handed the folder to Melissa, who took it reluctantly. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly before they widened in shock. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up a grainy photograph. Greer smirked. "That Miss Harrington is your father with the CEO of my client's company. From 10 years ago, at a private dinner. Seems they go way back." Tasha's stomach dropped. She moved closer, looking over Melissa's shoulder at the photo. It was unmistakably Judge Harrington, smiling and shaking hands, with a man she recognized as the CEO of the very corporation they were suing. "This is a conflict of interest," Melissa said, her voice rising. "You were friends with the man we're suing, and you didn't think to disclose this." "It's not what it looks like," Harrington said, his voice steady but desperate. "Yes, I knew him. But it was a long time ago, and we haven't spoken in years. It has nothing to do with this case." Greer shrugged, clearly enjoying the chaos he had unleashed. "That may be true, but it's going to look awfully suspicious to a jury, don't you think? The daughter of a judge suing his old friend. Makes you wonder what else has been conveniently left out." Melissa slammed the folder shut, her hands shaking. "Get out," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. Greer raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just doing my due diligence," he said before turning to leave. "Good luck explaining this one." As the door closed behind him, the room descended into silence once more. Melissa turned to her father, her expression a mix of fury and betrayal. "Is it true? Did you know him?" Harrington nodded reluctantly. "I did. But I swear, Melissa, I haven't spoken to him in years. This case blindsided me as much as it did you." Tasha felt the walls closing in. Not only was her personal life unraveling, but now the very case she had worked so hard on was at risk of being tainted by this revelation. She looked at Harrington, her voice quiet but firm. "Why didn't you say anything? Even if you thought it didn't matter, why wouldn't you tell us?" "I didn't think it was relevant," Harrington said, his voice breaking. "I thought I could stay out of it, just watch and support you both. I didn't want to make things harder for you." "Well, congratulations," Melissa said bitterly. "You've managed to do the exact opposite. The weight of everything was too much to bear." Tasha stood abruptly, grabbing her bag. "I need some air," she said, her voice tight. She left the room without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind her. She walked through the courthouse hallways, her mind racing. Everything was unraveling, and she had no idea how to fix it. Back in the office, Harrington and Melissa sat in tense silence. Finally, Melissa spoke, her voice low and cold. "If this ruins our case, it's on you. I hope you're prepared for that." Harrington didn't respond, the weight of her words sinking into him like a stone. For the first time in his career, he felt utterly powerless, the ground beneath him shifting in ways he couldn't control. Outside, Tasha stood on the courthouse steps, the cold air biting at her skin. She looked out at the city, her thoughts a jumbled mess of anger, hurt, and determination. The stakes had never been higher, and she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let this derail her. Not now, not when so much was on the line. How could she fight a battle that seemed rigged from the start? Tasha returned to the courtroom the next morning with a clear determination in her eyes. The revelations of the previous night had shaken her, but they hadn't broken her. If anything, they had given her a sharper focus. She wasn't just fighting for her client anymore. She was fighting for herself, for the truth, and for justice, no matter how tangled it had become. Melissa, however, was colder than usual. She barely looked at her father as she walked into the courtroom, her silence cutting deeper than words ever could. Tasha could feel the tension between them, but there was no time to address it now. The trial was reaching its conclusion, and they needed to be united for their client's sake. Victor Greer, ever the showman, delivered his closing argument with the confidence of someone who believed the scales had tipped in his favor. He hinted at conflicts of interest, casting doubt on the integrity of the case without explicitly naming Harrington. It was a sly move, one that painted their side as suspicious without providing concrete evidence. When it was Tasha's turn, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the jury. She spoke of truth, of accountability, of the bravery it took for her client to stand up against a powerful corporation. She reminded them of the evidence they had presented, the facts that couldn't be ignored, and the humanity at the heart of their case. As she spoke, she felt the weight of Judge Harrington's gaze on her. For a fleeting moment, she met his eyes and she saw something there. A quiet pride, a recognition of her strength. It gave her the push she needed to finish strong. The jury deliberated for hours, each minute stretching into eternity. Melissa paced the whole way, her frustration barely contained. Tasha sat quietly, replaying her arguments in her mind, searching for cracks she might have missed. Harrington remained in his chambers, alone with his thoughts, the weight of his dual roles, judge and potential father, pressing heavily on him. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in her hands. Tasha's heart pounded as the judge, one of Harrington's colleagues, asked for the decision to be read. "We find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreperson announced. Relief flooded Tasha's body as she glanced at her client, who was openly crying with gratitude. Melissa exhaled sharply, a small smile breaking through her earlier frostiness. It was a victory, hard-won and deeply satisfying. But the tension in the room didn't fully dissipate. There was still the matter of Harrington's revelation, the personal fallout that had yet to be addressed. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Harrington motioned for Tasha and Melissa to stay behind. "I know this isn't the place," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "But we need to talk. All of us." Melissa crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "About what, Dad? The fact that you kept secrets from both of us? Or the fact that your past almost ruined this case?" "I deserve that," Harrington said, nodding. "But before you decide how you feel about me, there's something you need to see." He pulled a folded letter from his jacket and handed it to Tasha. "This was sent to me years ago, but I didn't receive it until recently. It's from Angela." Tasha's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was her mother's, unmistakable. In it, Angela explained everything: their relationship, her reasons for leaving, and why she had never reached out to Harrington again. She wrote about her fear of rejection, her decision to raise Tasha alone, and her hope that one day Tasha might find the courage to seek out the father she had never known. Tasha's vision blurred as she read the final lines. Angela had written, "He's not perfect, but he's a good man. If you ever meet him, I hope you'll see that for yourself." When she finished, she handed the letter to Melissa, who read it in stunned silence. For the first time, her anger softened, replaced by something more complex, a mix of sadness, understanding, and a lingering sense of betrayal. "I don't know what to say," Melissa admitted, her voice quiet. Harrington looked at them both, his expression earnest. "I can't change the past. I can't undo the mistakes I've made. But I want to be better for both of you, if you'll let me." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Tasha spoke, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I want to try." Melissa nodded slowly. "Me too. It wasn't a resolution, not entirely. There were still wounds to heal, questions to answer, and trust to rebuild. But it was a start, a fragile, tentative step toward something new." As they left the courtroom, Tasha felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. And that, she realized, was a victory of its own. But just as she reached the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an email from someone she didn't recognize, with a subject line that read, "There's more you need to know about Judge Harrington." Her heart sank as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. The message was brief but chilling. The photo was just the beginning. "He's hiding more than you think." Tasha looked up, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The case was over, but her story with Judge Harrington was far from finished.